we're really, really excited to have him on Analogue and to have him here talking to us. So just a little bit of background. I'm not sure how much Rosie's already filled you in, but Max is a research fellow at USC's Brain and Creativity Institute. I already told you guys a little bit about sorry, that's my dryer. I already told you guys about the BCI, but he studies the neuroscience of feeling, which basically means the study of the nervous system and its connection to feeling and emotion, which he's going to tell you more about much better. And he studies under Dr. Damasio, who's one of the most recognized voices in this field in the world. So, I mean, he is in very, very good company. And we've had this very interesting conversation because I come from the political science background and Max from the science background. And he came to me with this argument that neuroscience can actually help re-inspire this idea of democracy. And that sounded really crazy to me. And Max, I want you to talk a little bit more about those ideas. I'm not sure exactly what you wanted to cover, but I know that was the last conversation that we had. But also you founded USC's first student-run think tank. And because we're a group of students, I wanted to see if you could also talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to hand you the mic and take it away.
Cool. Well, I wasn't actually going to talk about that, but
okay, you don't have to.
No, I can. Yeah. So just a little bit of background. I studied neuroscience at USC. I didn't know what I wanted to do coming into college. I was totally undecided. I think I thought that I was going to be a lawyer. And then I took a few neuroscience classes actually because my dad suggested it. He suggested that I try to study what the heck is Buddhist enlightenment, and that he thought neuroscience was the best way to do that. So I ended up finding my way into the Brain and Creativity Institute, which is, as Natalia mentioned, where Dr. Antonio Damasio works. I didn't have any idea who he was. I didn't know that he was anyone special. I didn't know that the lab was something special. I just wanted to get involved with research. And what followed was a really kind of crazy series of events. It was like, the more I learned about what his research had done and what it was doing to reshape sort of how we understand human knowledge and where we're at right now in the sort of trajectory of humanity, I started just like becoming dumbfounded that the more people weren't talking about this and that more people weren't aware of sort of where we were at this like turning point in really human civilization, but in the context of human knowledge. We know that technology is progressing faster than anybody could have possibly thought. The world is changing really quickly, but there isn't a lot of conversation about the fundamentals of how we understand ourselves, our mental experience, and the relationship of ourselves to the rest of the world. So, and that's really like at the root of it all. So there's also development in that space, and that's kind of what I want to talk about a bit now. So yeah, let's see. So so just to start off, I don't know if any of you know much about Antonio Damasio or his work, but essentially my work with him is focused on the nature of feeling. So what is going on in the body when we have different feelings? How can we understand those experiences in physiological terms? And how can we make sense of sort of what they're for in the context of evolution? And it's a big task, but he sort of got a 30-year jump on it. And I'm just so lucky to, that I came in at the time that I did. I don't really know how these things happen, but they do sometimes. So yeah, for those of you who haven't heard of Antonio Damasio before, he is one of the pioneers of the field of affective neuroscience. His work was sort of instrumental in reshaping both how we understand what emotions are, where they're put together in the brain, and also what their relationship is to reason, because that's been another point that has, there's been a lot of contentious arguments about it for the last like 2,000 years. And yes, that's 2,000 years, which is like really wild because it's sort of hard to even conceptualize like the time scale at which this stuff changes. But so the two things that he's really well known for are that, first of all, we used to think of emotions as being put together in the most recent parts of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex and the parts of the brain that are really human, that designate us as different from everybody else. And, we thought that emotions and feelings could only be something that humans could have because we're obviously so much more advanced than all these other animals. and that they were put together in these recently evolved parts of the brain. And his work sort of upended that, right? He was able to show that he was a neurologist by training, and he had patients that would come in with, deficits in emotion processing, and they would scan them. They would look at, what's going on in their brain, and they would find lesions in these deep, ancient parts of the brain. And so his work has basically, over the years, been understood to have shifted the understanding of where in the brain emotions are put together. And it turns out that they really depend on the brainstem, which is like the oldest part of the brain, or like right at the base. It's shared with basically every organism that has a nervous system, which is like pretty insane. So that's one thing. Feelings are put together by the brainstem, which is really interesting because of the role of the brainstem in regulating life. So the brainstem is a place where signals come from throughout the body. They all converge in the brainstem, and then they get processed in the brain, and then the signals go back to the body. But what that means is that in the brainstem, if you were to take a cross section of it and sort of look at the surface, you chop the brainstem, you look at the surface of it, what you would see is basically a map of the entire state of the body represented in the different patterns of activation in this cross section of the brainstem, because all of the signals from the whole body come through there. So that seems to be the closest that we've gotten so far to a physiological basis for feeling. It's this map of the state of the body. And that's just hugely important and really profound when you think about it. And we'll get to that a bit more later. But the other point is about what the relationship is between feelings and emotion and reason. And as you all are, I'm sure, aware, we've been taught for generations now that feeling and emotion and reason do not get along. They're kind of antagonistic to each other. And really, if you want to make good decisions, you should be unemotional. You should be as unemotional as possible, because that's how you do reason effectively. And Dr. Damasio had these patients that were unable to make effective rational decisions. And upon looking at what was going on in their brain, it was discovered that they had lesions in emotion processing brain regions. And this was people still don't seem to have fully processed this finding, but the implication is that you can't make effective rational decisions without the brain regions that are involved in processing emotion. So we used to think of emotion as being like this one way that we regulate life, and feeling as being this other way. And feeling is animalistic and basic and terrible and just leads you all the wrong directions. And reason is godly and important and human and special. But in reality, it seems that it's much more of a cooperative effort. You need emotion to basically guide the reasoning process. And emotion, since it's coming from the state of the body, reason ends up being informed by the state of the body and what it needs at any given time. So those are the basic elements that Dr. Damasio has sort of brought to the world over the last 30, that's probably more than 30 years by now, 40, 50 years. But people haven't realized it. It hasn't sort of been taken in really at all. And I'm going to talk a bit more about feeling specifically, about sort of what are the neurobiological elements that make it possible, and how do we understand those in terms of evolution. But first, I want to sort of, you are all very, very kind and saying that you're interested in these things, but feelings and physiology and all this stuff are kind of dense. So I figured it would be good to set the stage a bit by talking about why it's so important that this stuff is happening now in this time in history. And because it really is, it's insanely cool and insanely exciting and really profound. I mean, if you really sit back and think about it. So I'll try to frame it in that way a little bit. Then I guess a good place to start is that the way that we think about the world, the modern world, the way that we've built the world, the basic understanding that we have about how we have created modern society is that we've done so by being rational. It's all been based on reason. All of our good ideas, democracy, freedom, liberty, justice systems, economic systems, medicine, science, all of it, it's all been based on reason. That's the foundational assumption that the Western world is sort of operating under. And the important thing is that it isn't wrong. It's not totally wrong, but it's not a complete picture. And that idea can be traced back. It's not just the last few generations. It's not just our parents' generation that came up with this. that idea that the modern world and society has been built using reason, that idea can be traced back to ancient Greece, when the ancient Greek philosophers were sort of swimming in uncertainty and trying to figure out what about the world they could actually know to be true versus what about the world they might think to be true, but couldn't possibly actually be known. So they're puzzling over this question. They don't have science yet. They don't have systematic reason yet. They haven't, cracked the scientific method. Of course, children do the scientific method intuitively, but that's a separate point. So what they figured out, that these ancient Greek philosophers trying to sort out sort of what was true and what wasn't, they figured out that they could trust some things and they could not trust other things. And the things that they decided they could trust are the physical qualities of the external world, right? And because they're objective and consistent, and everybody who looks at the same rock sees the same rock. Everybody who drops an apple from the same height notices it falls in the same way. So those things were considered to be objectively true, not just true to a subjective observer. On the flip side, things that are considered unscientific and not likely to be true and trustworthy as bases for action are feelings and emotions, and sort of these all of the deeper questions of what it means to be human, pains and pleasures and all the stuff that's wrapped up in the human condition. Those are all sort of all the way back in ancient Greece. Those are segmented. Those are two separate categories. You have concerns about the human condition and feeling and emotion, relationships and fulfillment and all of these things. And then there's a hard line. And then you have science and truth and reason and everything that you can trust and base your actions on. And that's been the operating principle for around 2,000 years. It's sort of an artificial number though, because obviously it goes back until the beginning of time. We can say 2,000 years because that's when the segmentation officially started with these philosophers. And they did a great job. It was a huge step in human evolution to even come up with the idea that something like reason could be trusted and there could be something like objective truth. And they couldn't actually possibly have known that, using the tools available to them at the time, that emotion and feeling maybe shouldn't be put off to the side, and considered inaccessible to science. So it's only now, 2,000 years later, huge development in society later, huge amount of technical progress later, that we have machines, fMRI, PET scans, etc., that allow us to look inside the brain of an alive and conscious person in the same way that we look at a rock, and we can see in different people systematic, consistent physiological events that correspond systematically with reported mental events. So that's the watershed moment. No longer are subjective mental experiences inaccessible to science. They're not possible to demonstrate as being objective. But now, finally, for the first time ever, we can say, no, when I say that I'm feeling this kind of way, there are consistent patterns of brain activity that happen in me, that happen in all of you, and that happen in everybody else. And so, for the first time, we can start to understand that actually maybe these subjective mental experiences are not inaccessible to science. Maybe they shouldn't be relegated to the domain of the unscientific. And that has, huge implications, of course. So one of the interesting implications is that, we understand that we've built society using reason. And it's true, of course, we have built society using reason. But if we understand that reason is grounded in emotion and feeling, and if we understand that emotion and feeling are grounded in basic processes of biology, then suddenly there's an extra level that we've discovered about what's actually shaped the development of modern society. So we have all these institutions. We have, democracy itself. We have medicine. We have military, the police. They're getting a lot of attention recently, and rightfully so. And economic institutions, which are also getting a lot of attention, and rightfully so. All of these things we understand to have been created by reason, right? And so when they have problems, we don't know where to look. We think, okay, maybe either the institutions themselves need to be totally torn down, or human nature is just irrevocably flawed and we can't possibly organize society in a way that works for everybody. So I want to suggest that there's really another option, which is that we just haven't known what has been the underlying driving force that's motivated the creation of these institutions in the first place. And so it's inconceivable that we wouldn't have made mistakes in developing them. And it's almost inconceivable that those mistakes that we made when developing them wouldn't have metastasized into problems that are so tangled and systemic that they're basically impossible to solve, which is where we're at right now. So just taking those three examples, medicine is obviously homeostatic. It's like the outsourcing of the immune system's work to an institution. Your immune system keeps you safe. It deals with colds and flus as best as it can, heals bones, does all these incredible things. But there's some things that it can't do. And for those, we use medicine to sort of augment the immune system. And then, the military and police have a similar idea. The immune system does a huge favor to us in terms of figuring out what is dangerous to us, what is self, what is non-self, when is an invading pathogen, okay and fine to allow in, and when does it need to be, gotten rid of immediately because it causes a danger to us. And so even those institutions, you can sort of see that there's a relationship of the mandates of the military and the mandates of the police to some sort of immune process. Now, once again, they have huge problems in the way that they've been operating and have been run, but you can see that the ideal of them is consistent with these basic processes of life regulation. Probably the most interesting one to me is economic institutions. And I don't know a huge amount about economics. I'm not an economics expert, but I do know that the current economic models are getting a lot of criticism recently about being oriented towards amassing profit. Right? That is getting a huge amount of attention, and rightly so. But I think it's important to sort of think a little bit more about the origins of that. What's really going on below the surface? And so, most of you probably all know, I'm sure you all know the term homeostasis. It's sort of the basic process of maintaining life within its operational ranges. So you maintain levels of nutrients, of electrolytes, of fluids, et cetera, and you have a sort of equilibrium state. And various things knock you out of homeostasis, and then you have to come back to it. So it's a really great model, and it's right in a lot of respects, but it's also misleading in some respects. And one of those respects is that at the very basic level, life is about energy maintenance. Life is an energy-intensive process. It requires fuel. Your body does things with the fuel, and then you put out waste, and you grow, and you can act, and you can exert force, etc. Homeostasis is an idea about everything is at equilibrium. So if we port that idea over to thinking about energy balance, it really doesn't work. If it did work, you would have the idea that in order for an organism to survive, when it's at homeostasis, you have enough energy resources available to meet the demands of the moment, right? And that's just not the case, because that would actually be really dangerous. That would mean that when any state of life happens that's more or less energy intensive, you would just die. And states of life are totally different in the amount of energy that they require. Stress and fighting and fleeing and building things, moving around, are very energy intensive. States of relaxation, food intake, etc., are not energy intensive in the same way at all, and in fact can have a cumulative effect on the amount of energy that you have available. So if you were to be at an equilibrium between the energy demands of any given moment and the amount of resources that you have available, and any additional stress showed up, you just die. You just be like, okay, I'm done. That was a good run. But that's not what happens. Obviously, that's not what happens. We store huge amounts of surplus energy resources on our body. Every single organism in the history of organisms stores extra metabolic resources in their body. Bacteria, if you put them on a plate with extra food, they'll overeat and they'll store the extra as glycogen. We do the same thing. We have better tasting food. We eat huge amounts of it. We store the excess on our body. But that's not all. In addition to storing extra resources on our body for when maybe food is going to be difficult to come by, in addition to that, we have banded together in societies, and we've come up with rules and agreements that allow us to to have to compete within rules, to create value, and to have an additional storage of resources called bank accounts, right? We don't just rely on the fat that's stored on our body. It's really important that we have some, but we don't just rely on that. We have invented a new resource that is a sort of pluripotent. It can take many forms. It can be useful for many things, and that's money. And money, can buy you food. It can buy you shelter. It can buy you tools. It can allow you to do things. It can allow you to survive in a sort of much more comprehensive way than food can. And I think that's really, really fascinating, because it suggests that somewhere along the line, as we were motivated to create the economic institutions and the processes that we have now, this idea that we should be accumulating profit, we should be accumulating more of this resource, that idea got into the economic systems that we have now. It's part of it. It's the thing that's getting much criticism these days. But what's missing is an understanding of what the profit is for. And initially, really, the profit is for securing the life process against stresses that are unexpected, not like the enormous amount of luxury goods that some individuals are able to amass. And you can see that sort of along the way we've gotten a bit sidetracked, and our understanding of what value and what profit and what this really important resource is for has shifted from being really about sustaining life to all kinds of other things that have been socially enforced over really millennia, I think, at this point. Well, I don't know about millennia, maybe a couple hundred years. We'll leave it at that. So those three institutions are sort of just examples of the fact that many of arguably all of the institutions of modern society have their roots in these biological processes of life regulation, but we haven't known it. We haven't known that as we were building these institutions, we were doing so under the mandates of homeostasis. And so it's inconceivable that we haven't made mistakes, and it's inconceivable that those mistakes haven't caused problems. And yet, a huge number of people now are aware that there are massive mistakes there are massive problems in the way that these institutions are operating. But there's very, very little discussion. Let's be honest, there's no discussion about the root of these problems being in a misunderstanding of the motive forces that have motivated their creation in the first place. And that's kind of what I mean about the scale of this. I mean, if you have an element of human knowledge that's been missing for 2,000 years, that's a huge amount of iteration and building up of processes and protocols and institutions and organizations on top of a basis that's, most of it is sound. As I mentioned, these institutions do have remnants of their homeostatic motives, but it's just totally impossible that there haven't been these massive misunderstandings that have metastasized over time. So I personally think that if we were going to have any shot of addressing some of these honestly systemic issues that we have now, that it's going to be really important that we develop a sort of first principles framework for understanding what these institutions were for in the beginning, and sort of what their purpose is in the context of them being motivated by homeostasis and the effort to survive. So now that I've sort of talked about why this is exciting, we can hopefully get into sort of what feelings are, how they're produced, and what's really going on there. And the first place to start, I think, is to mention that generally we think of feelings and mental experiences being all about the nervous system, understandably, right? The nervous system is sort of, without the nervous system, none of this is happening. But there's been a sort of oversight of the nature of the relationship of the nervous system to the rest of the body. Similarly to the fact that there's been a huge misunderstanding about the relationship of the mind to the body. So there's mind-body dualism, and there's also nervous system, non-nervous system dualism. And we have this idea that the nervous system is insulated from the rest of the body, that the blood-brain barrier sort of keeps it safe and prevents anything from getting to it. And that's true. The blood-brain barrier does prevent large molecules from accessing the brain. But there are actually many places in the nervous system where there are strategic openings, where the nervous system is directly accessible to the molecules in circulation. So neurons are sort of, they're usually encased in myelin, right? Myelin is this fatty substance that encases neurons, and it allows the electrical signal to propagate much more quickly and much more directly. And we think of myelin as being like a huge advance. You know, all the best neurons are encircled by myelin, but really, it's only the new ones. And older neurons, which, you know, we talked about how the feelings and emotions are located, put together, their construction is dependent on the brainstem. The brainstem is super old, and the interoceptive, you know, apparatus, the part of the nervous system that allows feelings to be constructed, that allows you to know sort of what's going on in your viscera, those neurons are not myelinated. They're free of myelin. And so they're soaking in the blood. Blood is literally just encircling these neurons, and they're totally vulnerable to the things that are going on around them. And there are also openings in the ventricles where, which are basically pockets of fluid in the brain where circulatory fluid can get cycled through. So we didn't really know up until very recently that neurons that are unmyelinated are able to communicate like this with the state of the body. Now we know that at every spinal, at every piece of the spine, there's an opening. They're called ganglia. At every one of these ganglia in the spine, there's an opening where the circulatory fluid, the blood, is able to bathe these neurons. And so when you end up with the cross section at the brainstem that I talked about earlier, it's not just neural information. It's a readout of the entire chemistry of the entire body at that moment, sort of compiled via stages at every level of the spinal cord, which is wild. So that's one thing. And then in addition, when we learn about biology, we generally learn about each of the different physiological systems as being distinct. So we learn about the endocrine system, we learn about the immune system, and we learn about the nervous system as these separate entities that do very different things. And that's sort of what I learned, what I knew, until I started, you know, reading the research papers that are coming out, you know, much more regularly than the textbooks do. And really what we've learned now is that that's actually the idea of this siloing of these different organ systems is total garbage. They actually share molecules and receptors. So molecules that are native to the endocrine system have receptors in the immune system and in the nervous system. Molecules that are native to right, and I can go through all of them, but basically the point is molecules that come from cells of each of these distinct systems can bind to cells on the other systems, which gives you this picture of the different systems of the body being really, really deeply coordinated, constantly coordinated. There's this, and Dr. Damasio likes to use the word orchestra, and it's sort of poetic and beautiful, but it really is, it is really evocative of sort of what's going on. There's this incredible coordination that's happening between your heart, your gut, the hormones that are flooding through your bloodstream, you know, the dilation or tightness of your veins. All of it is happening in synchrony, and during different feelings, your body is doing different things. So we've talked about now how the nervous system is not separate from the body, and the nervous system receives and sends molecules through all of these different systems. Now, I want to just mention that, you know, the role of the nervous system in the context of evolution. And I think that's also really important because, you know, if the nervous system is the centerpiece of this story, and of course it's really important, none of this happens without the nervous system, but it's important to think about the fact that the nervous system is a really, really, really recent evolutionary development. It's super young, and most of the processes of life are much older than the emergence of nervous systems in evolution. So the nervous system didn't actually change that much about how life works. It made things easier. It you know, catapulted things into a whole nother paradigm. But the basics of life, that, you know, it's energy intensive, it accomplishes these processes, it has endocrine functions, immune functions, and it, you know, maintains its physiology within these operational ranges. Those core functions of life that are the basis of feeling, those functions are way older than the nervous system itself. And that's super important because it suggests that the idea that the nervous system is the center of the whole story is kind of, It's an overly simplistic view to be generous. So, what are the bases of life? The earliest way that life is regulated is through molecules. So bacteria exist in populations, and when circumstances in the environment that they're in change, they have to change their functional state. Just like when we get stressed, we burn resources like crazy in order to fight or flee. And when we're, consuming food, we're in a totally different state. In the same way, when bacteria encounter an environment that's not friendly to them, they change their physiological state also, and of the whole population. And that happens through the diffusion of molecules through the population. So they send molecules out, and they hit all the other bacterial cells, and as a result of that, their state changes. Then you get, multicellular organisms, and that same process of changing the state of the organism through molecular diffusion is the way that it happens at first. Very slow, but it works. And then, the next development that's notable for this is you get circulatory systems. So you get pipes, basically, that allow for directional flow of these molecules. So you're able then to strategically change the state of this part of the organism and change this part of the organism in a different way, because you have molecules that can be directed to different places. So circulatory systems allow for molecules to be transported more efficiently. And then nervous systems hit the scene. And nervous systems really just allow for this to happen, even faster and more efficiently. So nervous systems allow for a molecule to hit a nerve here, and then an electrical signal propagates, and then a molecule is released here. So instead of the molecule itself having to traverse through fluid to the point where it needs to go, you just have it happen much faster at the rate that electricity takes to be conducted. And so really, that's the big contribution of nervous systems to life regulation, is that they allow for the coordination of all of these different processes of life to be happening really, really rapidly and at a much larger scale than would be possible with just molecular diffusion alone. So let's think about what it is like to have a given feeling. There are infinite ones we could think about. We can maybe use like hunger as an example. When you think about hunger, so hunger is an example, but we can go even more basic. We can think about stress and relaxation. I guess, we'll come to hunger later. So stress and relaxation, you can notice that there are things happening in all of these different parts of the body. You can notice that there are changes in your gut, there's changes in your heart rate, there's changes in the rate of blood flow and the rate of breathing, in the tightness and relaxation of your throat. One of the main symptoms of anxiety, for instance, is a sensation of your throat closing. That doesn't happen when you're relaxed. When you're relaxed, your throat opens, and your voice actually gets deeper as a result of that. So there are all these changes that are happening. Your stomach is changing, your muscles are changing, your immune system is changing its state, the veins are changing, and also, the way that you're cognizing is changing. The way in which you perceive stimuli, the things that those stimuli evoke in your mind, and the behaviors that are provoked by them, that all changes as the state of your body adjusts to different situations. And so when you're stressed, for instance, your vision sort of narrows, your thinking becomes very focused on breaking down situations and focusing in on them, and that can be a real problem if you get stuck there. And when you're relaxed, everything sort of expands. This happens throughout your body, and in addition, it happens in your mind. Your perspective kind of widens. You become more playful and more exploratory. And so, what's happening in the brain as this is happening is that you're receiving signals from throughout the body, from chemicals coming from all of these different physiological systems. They're converging on the nervous system. The nervous system is sending these signals up to the brain. The brain is taking in visual input from your surroundings, trying to figure out what changes need to happen, and sending those signals for change back down through the body. And at the brainstem, in these low-level regions, there's an image of what's happening, of the entire state of the whole body and the environment. And that image seems to be, to the best of our knowledge now, the physiological basis of feeling. And let's see, so hunger. Hunger is an interesting example because part of it is you can really get a sense of the fact that of what all is being mapped by the nervous system. If you try to imagine being hungry without a feeling of being hollow, right, of being empty, you can't do it. There's a key element of the feeling of hunger is of being empty, of your stomach being sort of concave and collapsed in on itself. And that's really important to mention, because that's the kind of stuff that the nervous system is tracking. It's tracking the geometries of all of these different physiological, of the physiological plumbing, I guess you could say. Really interesting stuff. And then full, by the same token, being full after a meal, there's like, you're distended. There's a feeling you are full. Full is not an inappropriate term to use. So that is sort of a basic introduction to, I don't know, basic, but it's an introduction to sort of what we're learning now about how feelings are put together and where the sensations come from, and the fact that it is really the, at the very tail end of evolution, that these ancient processes that are much more ancient than nervous systems themselves are now finally just able to be expressed in mental terms as feeling, because of the fact that the nervous system produces these images of them, and that didn't exist before. But the processes existed long before, long before. So I guess now it's reasonable to turn to sort of, what does this all mean for? What does this mean? Why is this interesting? What are the things that I think this gives us takeaways? And it does several things, for me at least. One of which is that it makes a very compelling case for shared experience between people, right? If our feelings are based in the state of our body and in the state of our physiology, then it's very, very likely that my feelings feel like your feelings. We may have them at different circumstances, but when I'm scared, the feeling of being scared, the quality of fear that happens in my throat, in my lungs, in my heart, in my stomach, the tensing of my whole musculature, and the narrowing of my perspective, the heightened sensation for hearing and all of these things, that experience is likely to be the exact same in each one of you. And, of course, we may experience fear in different circumstances, but when we are in fear, the feeling of it is the same. And that's a really, that's a huge deal. Being able to demonstrate the fact of shared experience is just incredibly important for all things relating to empathy and human affairs. Another thing that it suggests, which is a little more contentious, but I think is defensible, and I'm happy to field disagreement. I've yet to be argued against effectively on this one, is that I think that it suggests that we're all oriented towards a common good. And the reason that I think that's the case is that we're all oriented towards positive feeling and away from negative feeling, right? That's just basic. And we often think that positive feeling relates to states of life. So it's true that positive feeling relates to states of life that are better, and negative feelings relate to states of life that are worse. Our problem is that we often think of states of life that are better or worse as just being our own state of life. And we don't recognize that actually, our well-being, our own well-being, is totally dependent on the well-being of other humans, and also the well-being of the broader ecological system that we depend on. We can't be very healthy without animals and plants, because we need food and air. It doesn't get any simpler than that. And so it's possible that our intrinsic orientation towards positive feeling is simultaneously an orientation towards improving the state not only of our own bodies, but of the broader system that we're a part of. Because our well-being, our peak fulfillment state, is dependent on the larger system also being in a healthy state as well. So that's a pretty encouraging way of seeing the world and seeing other people that I think is really, it's really wonderful. And then the other thing that it suggests, and this was actually the basis for starting Novus, the think tank, which we can talk about later if you want. This all suggests that we each have value and actually belonging in this sort of broader effort to move towards the common good. And the reason for that is simple. We all have two qualities that are necessary, and they're feeling and a subjective perspective. And if feeling orients us in a direction that is toward the well-being of the system that we're dependent on, then what a subjective mental perspective does is it gives us a unique lens on how exactly to go about it, how exactly to pursue the common interest. And that's really, super important, because there's a lot of concern about sort of collectivist ways of seeing the world and collectivist ways of organizing society. And usually the response is, no, we're all individuals. We all have to just be individuals and focus on our individuality. And I just don't understand why it isn't clear that they're both true. We can all be oriented toward the collective well-being because we depend on those larger systems. And simultaneously, we can all have independent value, inherent value in this effort, simply because we've lived different lives, we've learned different things. The way that we process the world is different than everybody else. So we have, each of us, this unique lens on reality. We can only see the world out of our eyes. And so you can say that that's limiting. We have a limited view of the world. But the flip side of it is that it's actually augmented. We actually see more of the world than other people. Each of us, everybody, sees more of the world than is actually there, because we're constantly projecting our past experiences, the things that we've learned, the patterns that we've taken in, onto reality. So we all have this limited perspective, and no one person, it's logically impossible for one person to understand the entire world and all of its complexity. But by the same token, we each have this inherent value, because we see more things than are true. And that's a really, really exciting sort of proposition to sort of base things on. And the obvious implication is that we can build much better solutions. We can build much better understandings of the way the world works when we integrate diverse perspectives. Like that's the whole point. It's the whole point a case could be made that that's the whole point of forming societies in the first place. So now I want to make clear that these ideas, that there's shared experience, that we're oriented toward the common good, and that there's a value and a belonging of each individual within this broader patchwork. Those aren't new ideas. I'm not taking credit for them. It would be really, really, really ludicrous of me to try to do that. We've had those ideas for a huge amount of time. They're largely the basis of justifying the idea of democracy and free society. Why would you possibly think that the idea that democracy was a good idea if people don't have shared experience, they're totally unpredictable, they're all not oriented in any common direction, and really they have no value because they're just separate entities? It doesn't make sense to give the people authority if that was true. It would be a terrible idea. It would be a terrible, terrible, terrible idea to try to create something like democracy, which is a huge bet on the goodness and the reliability and the trust of people, if those things weren't the case. Now, when the ideas of democracy were sort of coming about, these ideas of shared experience, of orientation toward the common good, and of the value of the individual, the ideas existed, but they existed in ancient philosophy, right? It was like John Locke was contemporary at that time. And John Locke is no longer contemporary, right? We've had a lot of thought leaders since then, over the course of the 1900s, in particular, that have sort of taken the place of these ancient, I shouldn't say ancient, these older philosophies that sort of laid the foundations upon which we've built free society. We have the whole neoliberalism movement. We have Ayn Rand. We have Ayn Rand, I think it is. We have all these people that have sort of come in with new philosophies that are just based on thought experiments, and they've taken the conversation and they've pointed in a totally different direction. So while I don't claim credit for these ideas, I think it's really, really important to emphasize that. I do think that the only reason I bring them up is that this is the first time ever that we've been able to articulate a support of these ideas of shared experience, of a common orientation towards the common good, and of value of an individual. It's the first time we've been able to articulate those ideas and justify them in the language of science. That is the first time that that's happened. And that's a huge step, just because it's all relied on thought experiments before. And yeah, just in closing and wrapping things up now, I think that it's very clear that a biological understanding of feeling is going to make its way into popular consciousness over the next 30 to 50 years or longer, at whatever time scale it happens. It will happen. It's sort of inconceivable that it's not going to happen. But we're now at the point where where we know enough to make it happen, but there's not enough attention on the fact that this is a piece of knowledge that we have available to us now. It may happen in our lifetime that people start to be aware that there's a new way of seeing the world, a new way of thinking that validates the things that wise people throughout time have known to be true, to care about each other, work together, diversity is important, justice, equality, all these things. The fact that we can now make a rationale for these things in the objective and evolving language of science, that's not something that's widely recognized now. It will be at some point, whether that's during our lifetimes or later. And but I think it's inevitable that shift will happen, because I think that it will offer a real competitive advantage to individuals, to organizations, and to institutions to sort of base their operations on these things in the future. Yeah, I think that the organizations and institutions that are able to take this on and start articulating their purposes, their policies, their missions in terms of this biological foundation, a motive towards flourishing, and and by extension of that, through all of the values that I mentioned above, I think those organizations are going to do better. They're going to become much more compelling forces in the world. And I think people that take these ideas into their lives realize that they have an inherent value because they have a unique perspective that comes from life experience. They see things in the world that other people don't see. They see problems that other people don't see as being important, as more important than others. And they see solutions that other people can't possibly imagine because they don't have the same life experiences. I think the people that integrate that into their worldview and base their actions on it are going to be the more effective leaders going forward. And I think that the organizations that take this stuff in and adjust their operations accordingly are going to be the more effective organizations going forward. Just because this is a basic principle that underlies the whole fabric of everything. And so I'm really excited about the future. I'm kind of terrified, right, about the short term. I think all thinking people really are. But I think that if we can possibly manage to make it through some of the immediate stresses that exist for modern society, we are on the edge of a new era that is on the scale of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And I don't think that that's an exaggeration, because those are the times when these ideas were last formed. That is the time scale that we're talking about. And it's really difficult to conceptualize. It's really difficult to even understand that that's happening. And I don't know that it's clear exactly what you do when you have a sense that there's been a discovery that could result in that kind of change, but the world doesn't know yet. So that's kind of what, that's where I spend all my time. That's where I hang out in my mind. And that's really what I think is the most important thing that I have to offer at this point, is just communicating sort of what we have accomplished in the search for knowledge, and the fact that it offers a really, really encouraging and supportive and hopeful template for going forward that is empowering and does all the things that I think we want it to. So, I didn't mention Novus. Novus is a student-run think tank that sort of tries to take this and put it into practice. So we hold space for students to come together and talk about the problems that they care about in the world. They do research, they trust themselves, they learn how to examine these things and trust their perspectives, and they get practice solving problems in the community. And it's really, more than anything, it's an effort to sort of empower people to think about the world and realize that their perspectives may actually have value, and also to build community by working on something like that. And it was inspired by the idea that, like, if this is all true at a biological level, then it should be the most fulfilling thing to come together with a bunch of people who also care about the state of the world from different perspectives, and to just talk about these things and work on problems together. That should be really fulfilling if all of the other stuff is true, if we're oriented in all these ways. And And I have been sort of shocked and surprised and incredibly humbled and grateful by the fact that it seems to actually be working. More people than I ever would have imagined have showed up and found community and sort of found a new voice, and they've blossomed and grown, and it's just been incredible. And the whole thing really started because I was super lonely at USC. I was super lonely. I didn't have any friends to talk to about the state of the world and the things that are going on. And I figured I'd plant this flag and see if anybody shows up. And it was stupid of me not to do it sooner. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, that was a lot, but yeah, have at it. I hope it's been sort of at least a little bit interesting.